Welcome everyone. I'm Keisha Ali from the Department of Religion here at Boston University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's Health Humanities event, Working Against Domestic and Sexual Violence in Muslim Communities. This is the second in a series about American Muslims and public health crises. The first was a panel on Islam, race, and COVID-19 last fall. Tonight's conversation is between two important figures in the struggle against domestic and sexual violence in American Muslim communities. Professor Juliane Hammer from UNC Chapel Hill is the author of Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence, recently published by Princeton University Press. Dr. Hammer is a preeminent scholar of women, gender, and sexuality in American Muslim communities, on which topics she has published widely. And Nadiah Mohajir, who holds a Master's of Public Health, is the co-founder and executive director of Heart, Women, and Girls, an organization that does sexual health and sexual violence awareness, programming, and advocacy. Ms. Mohajir's public health and reproductive justice work is focused on her hometown of Chicago, and it's been recognized with a number of awards. My Boston University Medical School colleague, Professor Lance Laird, will be moderating their conversation, which will include time for questions and answers, and you can put your questions in the chat. I'm especially pleased he agreed to moderate this conversation because his own scholarship looks at Muslim identity and public health in the US. He's also worked with the Greater Boston Muslim Health Initiative on a number of issues, including domestic violence. Before I turn things over to Dr. Laird, I want to thank the supporters of this program. In addition to the Religion Department and the Health Humanities Project, they include the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Program, the School of Public Health, the Boston Medical Center Domestic Violence Program, and the Arts and Sciences Core Curriculum. And last, but by no means least, this event was funded by the NEH Distinguished Teaching Professorship held by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Petro, and it was capably organized by the core curriculum Sophie Klein with assistance from Zach Boss. So thank you very much. I welcome you. I will turn things over to Dr. Laird, and please note that the program is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Health Humanities site when we are finished.
So thank you very much, Keisha, Dr. Ali. And I'm very pleased to be here and privileged to be here with these two inspiring women who've done so much to work against sexual and domestic violence in the United States. And I thought we would start this evening because many of you may not be familiar with their work, by giving them a chance to sort of summarize their approach. So we could start with Dr. Hammer and then with Ms. Mohajir.
Thank you. Thank you to BU and everyone who's been involved in organizing this. I will say that it's a special experience for me to not just give a book talk, which I have done since the book came out in August 2019, but rather be in conversation, which is for me actually the most important part. So I called the book Peaceful Families, inspired by the name of a particular organization that was founded and operates in the Washington, D.C. area, the Peaceful Families Project. And I want to draw attention to the subtitle of the book, which is American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence. So this continuous research that I've done over the past 2 decades overall that has focused on Muslim activism for social justice with a special focus on gender justice. And this particular book, for many different reasons, including the fact that it is a very difficult topic, or was a very difficult topic, has been 10 years in the making. I had developed an interest in issues of domestic violence and gender-based violence through work that I was already doing, and was jolted into action together with many other Muslim Americans in early 2009 after the murder of Asia Zubair. So there was this moment in which my existing interests sort of came together with this really terrifying event, and responses from Muslims, Muslim organizations in particular, that were significantly more public than anything that I had seen before that. So the book is based on ethnographic and textual materials. I interviewed advocates in the Muslim identified movement against domestic violence, and I also attended a significant number of events, both public and less public, observed those, so engaged in participant observation, and collected a really large number of materials, including YouTube videos, writings, journal articles, etc. So the selection principle for me was to focus on people who identify as Muslim and people whose work is framed by having something to do with Islam related to anti-domestic violence work. That seems important to point out because it's not an attempt at mapping either the Muslim-oriented or Muslim-framed domestic violence landscape, so to speak, and that landscape as it exists does overlap in significant ways with mainstream anti-DV efforts, with other religious efforts, with inter-religious efforts, and with also, in the significant for Muslims, ethnically focused organizations and movements. So what I identified as sort of the foundation for the book was 3 areas in which those Muslim efforts take place, where I see them taking place. The first one is to raise awareness of domestic violence, so the issue of domestic violence in Muslim communities. The second one is to provide direct services to victims and survivors. And the third one is to provide or offer what I think of as education to the mainstream, so mainstream service providers, law enforcement, and lawyers in particular. And in the various organizations that I looked at in the work of various advocates, these 3 often overlap, but there are sort of distinctions in how that work is oriented, and also an interesting point to maybe come back to how it's funded. And I make a number of arguments that I have come to think of as important. One is an ethic of non-abuse as a baseline for work against domestic violence that has also helped me rethink the relationship between theory and practice. The second one is that I come to this project as a Muslim feminist scholar committed to gender justice, but who through this work also had to rethink her own approach to what it means to critically analyze, and whether Muslim feminist frameworks may also need to be adjusted in the context of this work. The third one is one that I hadn't really planned on, but that happens throughout the book, which is to think about what our ethical responsibility is as scholars as we engage in analysis and critique. Scholars are often asked to be critical, and so I ask repeatedly in the book, what are we critical of and what purpose does it serve to be critical? And I trace throughout various chapters religious arguments against domestic violence, so arguments that are framed in religious terms. That takes a number of different sort of shapes. I'm interested in particular in a conversation that American Muslims more generally often have, which is the relationship between religion and culture. That shows up repeatedly. That wasn't my idea, it already showed up, but I also think there's a bigger framing or sort of a bigger question of what the question of domestic violence and work against it has to do with questions of religious authority and textual interpretation. And obviously it's like 200 pages long, so there would be many more things to say, and I want to say them all now, but I'm hoping that at least some of those come up in the conversation.
Great, thank you. I think that's a very helpful introduction, and we will get into more as we go along, just to start the conversation. So Nadiah, you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much again. Before I begin, I wanted to express my gratitude to you, Lance and Keisha, and the entire Department of Religion at Boston University for inviting me to share Heart's work today with everyone, and most importantly, be in conversation with the amazing Juliane Hammer. I don't know how appropriate it is for me to fangirl while being on this panel with all of you, but I do want to you all to know that the inner girl inside of me is just thrilled and screaming with joy. So thank you so much. So I wanted to share a little bit about Heart, and then obviously go into some conversation with Juliane. So we are a national nonprofit that's been working for the past decade to promote sexual health and sexual violence prevention in Muslim communities. And, you know, we were founded out of a need when myself and a colleague were consulting at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Women's Health. And we were given the task of designing a campaign or program that was reaching Muslim women and girls. And we convened a group of stakeholders, and ultimately what we hosted was this day-long health and wellness day for moms and daughters to come together and have conversations about their bodies, about peer pressure, relationships, puberty, and sex. And we honestly thought we'd move on to the next project. But something really interesting happened. People asked when we would do the next one. And shortly after that, I met my colleague Seher, who was actually living in Singapore at the time, and Samira, who was in Canada at the time, who were actually doing similar work in their local communities as well. And what we learned when we exchanged stories was that while the communities we were working with were as diverse as they could possibly be, many of the people that we worked with spoke about their frustrations of not having access to sexual health and violence information that considered faith and cultural identities. And also expressed that they just felt like they had to navigate these issues and conversations alone and not feeling like they had the tools or the language to sort of navigate that. So ultimately, that was why we exist, and that was why we were founded, to sort of dismantle some of the stigmas and silence that looms around talking about sex and sexual violence in faith communities, in particular Muslim communities. So, you know, just real quick overview. Programmatically, what we do is in our acronym. So health education, advocacy, research, and training. You'll also learn, if you go to our website, we love acronyms. We use them for everything. So, so health education is exactly what you think. It's where we provide in-person and virtual programming and health information on various topics to equip people with the information that they need to make informed decisions. Advocacy is where we work with individuals who need referrals to services like trauma-informed therapy or case management. Research is when we work with local universities to deepen our understanding of these Muslim communities. And training is when we work to deepen the capacity of mainstream professionals and Muslim leaders that are better, that want to be able to meet the needs of the Muslims that they're serving. So that's just an overview of our work. And I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about, just real quick, some of the macro level questions that we also are exploring in this work. And as they, you know, emerge as we continue this work. So our work brings together the best practices in public health education and also core values of Islam, such as compassion and justice. And, you know, we're working to advance simultaneously in both mainstream and Muslim spaces. So, for example, we challenge mainstream Western feminist movements that don't consider or include Muslim lived experiences. And at the same time, we're also challenging Muslim communities to address the silence and stigma around sex and sexual violence. So because we use public health frameworks to do our work, we often look at both empowering individuals with the information and resources that they need to make informed decisions, but we also look at some of the systems that need to be reimagined or dismantled in order to be able to reduce the barriers to these services and information.
Thank you very much. I think those are very helpful introductions. One of the things that I wanted to sort of talk about at the beginning is, what do you see as the links between sexual violence and domestic violence? We have all of these, terms: gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. Which ones are most useful, and are some more easy to address than others, or some more difficult to address than others? How do you see the relationship between these different forms of violence? Juliana, why don't you start?
I got called on. Okay. So I think in my work, this question of the relationship between the two shows up on several different levels. And one, the sort of obvious one, and maybe a really surprising one for me, was that I took my cue in using domestic violence, which I used throughout the book, from the advocates that I was talking to. So terms other than domestic violence or domestic abuse, which are used interchangeably, don't often show up in the work that I looked at. So gender-based violence and intimate partner violence don't seem to be terms that show up, at least in Muslim work. I came across them in various contexts, but not sort of as central. Mm-hmm. So on that level, I took my cue from that. I recognized from vast amounts of literature that that's an ongoing debate, because the debate about the terms has repercussions for what's included and what doesn't get included, and who doesn't and does get included. So on that level, there are various sort of repercussions to thinking of domestic violence first as violence inflicted by one partner on the other partner within marriage. So marriage is an important sort of framing, at least for Muslim advocates, that intimate partner violence is actually trying to sort of open up. And so that's one reason why that is not the preferred term. And the other challenge, I think, is that domestic violence, sometimes it's also used to describe other forms of violence within a family that are not between partners, but committed by in-laws or children or siblings, etc. And on a different level and in a different way, sexual violence, to me, very surprisingly, as a feminist scholar who's had sort of expected everything, sexual violence very rarely showed up in my conversations with Muslim advocates, and is occasionally acknowledged as a form of domestic violence, but then again is limited to within marriage. And so I think there are sort of really complicated ways in which the very unwillingness to talk about domestic violence is exacerbated by the resistance to talking specifically about sexual violence. And my sort of assessment here would be that part of why this is such a complicated debate just about the terms has to do with what Nadiah was already bringing up, which is an analysis of systems of oppression, because some of what I just said leads directly to a feminist critique of patriarchal systems. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily the conversation that anti-DV advocates want to have or are actively having.
Okay. Nadiah, would you like to add to that? Why do you use the term sexual violence?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I love everything you said, Juliana, but and I just want to add to that and say that, yes, it's really surprising to me, actually, about your reflections around the DV advocates not really talking about sexual violence, because when you actually look at, the spectrum of gender-based violence, right, which is very inclusive of financial, emotional, sexual, and domestic intimate partner violence, there's often a lot of intersections, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's important that we recognize those intersections, and when we are doing crisis intervention with a sort of a victim, oftentimes the other types of violences do show up, and we have to address them in the same way that we address the DV work or the sexual violence work that we're doing. And so, you know, I want to acknowledge that there are intersections. I also want to acknowledge that, of course, there are key differences. And that's why there's a whole DV movement and there's a whole sexual violence movement that are separate and should be separate because they do manifest in different ways. But one of the things that you know, to your question, Lance, about, you know, what is harder to address? One of the things that I was thinking about is, you know, one of the explicit differences between sexual violence and domestic violence is that DV often does manifest as visible injuries, while, you know, sexual violence is not manifesting in the same visible way. And I think that's a really important difference, even when thinking about if there's like a criminal justice case involved, right? And like, you know, when the cops or detectives or lawyers ask for quote unquote evidence, oftentimes there's very little evidence when we're talking about sexual violence. The other thing that I want to note is that it's always on a spectrum, right? So when we think of sexual violence, we immediately go to rape as a community and as people, right? We immediately think of rape, and other forms of sexual violence are minimized or just not talked about or not recognized. But it's really important to think about how harassment, molesting, unwanted sexual touches can be just as traumatic and even harder to address, right? Because they could have over a period of time. It might be harder to prove, quote unquote, et cetera. And so I think, you know, those are some really key connections. And to your point, Juliana, about the systems, I think that's a really important point that we think about a lot at Heart is, you know, a lot of times gender-based violence is about crisis intervention. It's about getting the victim safety. It's about getting them services and getting them therapy. And it's very individualized. And because our focus and our money and our resources are like, you know, funneled to that crisis intervention, you know, and we've been doing it for decades and decades and decades. And then we look at the statistics and we're like, wait a minute, why haven't we eradicated domestic violence? Why haven't we eradicated gender-based violence? And that's because prevention requires addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, which are the systems of oppression, like racism, anti-Blackness, homophobia, Islamophobia. And those are so challenging to address that's why oftentimes we just get caught in the cycle of crisis intervention.
So I think this is I think that's really helpful, and to sort of frame this as, you know, there's the crisis intervention and there's the structural analysis and trying to deal with these larger structures of violence. I'm wondering though, the other term sort of in the room right now is Muslim communities. You know, and you're both talking, you know, you've used the term Muslim identified, you've used Muslim communities, you haven't said mosque, you haven't said Muslim Student Association. When we're talking about working within Muslim communities or using religious, I think you said accessing resources, Nadiah, accessing resources that are sensitive to culture and faith. Why is the faith important, and where do you find Muslims?
I mean, so I want to first of all address the fact that when I talk, I often try to always use the plural of Muslim communities to recognize that there's more than one, and that it's necessary to acknowledge that that we are the most diverse religious minority in North America, in every sense. So not just racially, but in the ways that we practice, in the ways that we have access to education, et cetera, right? Where we live even. And so I don't think it is appropriate or does it justice when we say the Muslim community. I think it often puts way too much pressure, and it results in, both Muslims and also mainstream media kind of making our communities sort of a monolith and representative of just one way of thinking. And so I definitely want to encourage everyone to use the fact that there's multiple Muslim communities. And Muslims, to your point, Lance, are everywhere, right? They're not just in the mosque or in the MSAs. That's where we tend to think about, because oftentimes, faith is an important part of a lot of Muslims' lives, and the mosque and the MSA are sort of institutions that can help facilitate that spiritual sort of fulfillment. But I think it's interesting to look at, the stats. I've seen anywhere from like 10% to 25% of only 10 to 25% of Muslims actually regularly attend a mosque. So what are the 75%? Where are they, right? And we have to make sure that our services and information and our efforts go beyond the mosque in order to reach all the diverse communities that are out there.
Juliane, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Sure. So I want to point out that here there's a really big difference between what I've been doing and what Heart is doing, in the sense that I'm looking at how Muslim advocates consider community, right? Who they read as community and want to address as community. And I think it's clear that mosques in particular, mosques and community centers, sometimes also MSAs, but more mosques and community centers, are simply sort of clearinghouses for access to certain Muslims. And that because the assumption that Islam matters there is sort of built into the institution. And the book ends with a chapter where I think about what it would look like, actually based on a conversation with advocates, what it would look like to think of community differently. So think of communities in different places. But what then comes up in that conversation is also then, why does this have to be Muslim, right? So like the minute you think differently about Muslim communities, and there are many types of virtual communities, not institutionalized communities, people come together around things related to Islam in all kinds of ways. But of course, the assumption that people who go to mosques also have certain ideas about what Islam is and why that Islam then can be actualized to work against domestic violence is in some ways a limitation that I don't want to criticize it. I do point out that that excludes a lot of people. And if there's one thing that I think is clear from my work and the work of others, it is that mosque-based services are really only available to certain victims and certain survivors. And so for some others, they would never consider a religious leader a frontline first provider. So for me, it's a way to critically think about how these communities are constructed by advocates that they seem to be talking to, and what assumptions that's based on, but also to ask how can organizations reach others? And I think Heart is sort of an example for thinking much more critically and much more widely about how that could be accomplished. I did want to say something before I forget it that seems important with regards to the domestic violence and sexual violence conversation. So one of the really big sort of realizations for me in doing the research, somewhere like halfway through, was that while I had thought of domestic violence and work against it as feminist issues, it is actually entirely possible also in the mainstream to do anti-domestic violence work and not embrace feminist critique of patriarchy as a systemic issue. A lot of domestic violence work in the United States more generally is not feminist in nature. And I think that with sexual violence, it's actually more difficult to get that distance, right? Like to sort of distance oneself from that as a feminist issue. So yeah, for me, realizing that you can work against domestic violence and not touch feminist anything with a 10-foot pole is actually possible and happens all the time. That was big. That was a big realization for me.
Well, I think just to continue with that, I mean, I'd like you to explain a little bit more, because you describe a variety of approaches to domestic violence, anti-domestic violence. So in these Muslim identified organizations in your book, and you point out that they interpret Islamic religious sources in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. But what you say is that they share a starting point, what you've called an ethic of non-abuse, mm-hmm. right? That guides their work, but it can lead to divergent interpretations of the Quran, the Hadith, the tradition in general. Can you explain how that happens? And what kinds of interpretations they come mm-hmm. up with? Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to put them on a spectrum. And so I think what I just said about domestic violence not necessarily being a feminist issue, solely a feminist issue, that you can be against domestic abuse in all its forms and not be a feminist, was news to me, but clearly was is built into the work that Muslim advocates do. So much so that some of the efforts and some of the interpretations that you were sort of pointing to, I describe in the book as part of what I call protective patriarchy. So in fact, a system or like a framework that allows advocates sort of unequivocally to say domestic abuse is wrong. It's ethically wrong to abuse someone else physically and financially and psychologically and all these other ways. Oppression is not allowed in Islam. But that doesn't mean that we're against marriage or that we have issues with the husband and father being the head of the household. And having a hierarchical relationship within marriage, right? So like these are not mutually exclusive in a protective patriarchy framework. They actually become an active ethical imperative to not be abusive, right? So the protective part, patriarchs have responsibilities to not be abusive.
So it's the real men protect women kind of.
Yes, yes. And I mean, in that discourse, obviously women are not in a position of power, but I also really had to confront the fact that that framework may actually land more convincingly in the Muslim communities that are being addressed in the first place. So one of the sort of barriers perhaps that I see has to do with the resistance to considering anything feminist, including a critique of Muslim marriage ideals as at all valid in any way. So, and then there's sort of a part of your question that is actually really complicated for me to address. I mean, all of it is obviously complicated, but complicated in the sense that this ethic of non-abuse is sort of, as I earlier called it, the baseline. And there's no one in that movement, and that kind of also makes sense, who's sort of saying, well, you know, under certain circumstances, a little bit of hitting is okay. And what I found interesting is that commitment against domestic violence, I don't think comes out of reading the Quran and finding that there, but that it is based on what I think of as experience. One of the things I asked actually all of the advocates I interviewed extensively was, why are you doing this work? What is it that made you go in that direction for however long you're doing it or can do it? And often the answer had something to do with either witnessing or experiencing some form of domestic abuse and recognizing that it is wrong. So that's why I think of it as an ethic. And then there is a second step that I think happens later for most of the people I talk to, where they then turn to Islamic textual sources to find support for that. Mm-hmm. And so what then ends up happening is stuff that's is sort of statements like Islam is against domestic violence. There is no place for domestic violence in Islam. And what that does is elevate Islam as a construct, as an abstract, but also the Quran very often sort of specifically to a place of self-evident authority, mm-hmm. in which interpretation, like a variety of interpretations, actually become counterproductive, right? If you say, well, you can interpret various verses in the Quran in these different ways, then the Quran doesn't have as much authority to say, no, this is wrong. It's always wrong.
Right.
So what ends up happening is sort of I don't think it's even a spectrum. It's really that people sort of land in really different places, and often, and that seems to me to be an important point, often how that argument is made is also situational to the community that it is addressed to, which is something that is actually, to me, was really amazing to watch, that someone going into a Muslim community setting to raise awareness of domestic violence would read where people are at and what would be the most convincing way to get to that point that it is wrong and that it shouldn't happen.
So is that a sort of pragmatic flexibility, adaptability of interpretation for a particular audience?
Yes, I think so, and so I want to be really careful that I frame it at least in positive terms, because of course it's also very easy to frame that as manipulation, mm-hmm. right? Like as manipulating interpretation to serve a particular purpose. But that's why this ethic of non-abuse is so important, because that is holding all of these different ways to getting to that place together.
Yeah, I would love to have Nadiah reflect on how Heart does this too, because, you know, I mean, Nadiah, you're developing this resource on sexual health for Muslim girls and women, and trying to put sexual health in the context of Islam, but also using sort of secular public health and medical resources and understandings of health and healthy development. How are you doing this? Is what Juliane is calling this ethic of non-abuse, or this sort of, you know, experiential awareness that certain things are wrong and certain things are good, then leading you to interpret the tradition in particular ways?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I want to also kind of respond to something you said, Juliana, about can it be seen as a manipulation of interpretations? And I think for me, and one of the things that we emphasize a lot at Heart, is that the beauty of Islam is that there is such a diverse range of opinions, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality and all of these issues. And so for me, it's less about manipulation, and it's more about challenging dominant interpretations that may be harmful to the communities that we're trying to work with, right? So, you know, to your question, Lance, about how are we, thinking about this when we talk about sexual health and violence in our communities, you know, obviously I want to name that this work is still evolving. It's based on what we learn from those that we're in partnership with, and really thinking about, you know, reclaiming some of the Islamic values that we find inspiring. So, for example, rahma, which is compassion, justice, equality. These are all core Islamic values that are intended to be at the foundation of human interaction and relationships, right? That is undeniable. If you read the Quran, if you read, you know, the Hadith, it's undeniable that these are core Islamic values that that were you know, named as super important values. And so, you know, we use those, and then we merge that with best practices in public health education and research that informs us about the merits of why it's important for people to have access to sex education, you know, why it equips people with the information they need to make informed decisions, delay sex if they want to, etc. And also look back to a lot of the look at the history of how gender and sex was talked about before colonization, right? And after colonization, and how a lot of the stigma and the shame and the silence that we feel around sex is actually a function of being colonized, and Christian viewpoints around sex and sexuality. So really just trying to reclaim our history and just saying, this is very much like, people want you to believe that this is in conflict with Islam, but it's very much a part of our history from the beginning. And here's some of the stories and the papers and the interpretations that we've learned about that can uplift that. One of the other things that we like to do is to uplift a lot of the amazing and brilliant work of Muslim women scholars that's happening right now in America, right? So scholars such as Dr. Keisha Ali, who's right here on this call, Juliana, who's here, Dr. Asifa Qureshi, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, among others, to really challenge these dominant and conventional ideas about sex and gender. And also invite people to understand that Islamic law on these issues was not straight and narrow. And in fact offers many gender equitable interpretations and opinions. And I did mention in my introduction that oftentimes we also do the other thing, right? Where we challenge mainstream feminist sex positivity frameworks on the aspects that don't work for us. So, historically, if you look at the way religion is framed in Western sex positivity frameworks, it's really framed often as a tool of oppression and like sort of being in conflict with being like quote unquote sexually liberated. And we know that many Muslims find their faith guidelines to be empowering and to are really inspired and proud to live by those guidelines and guide their own sexual health decision making, including abstinence, which we consider to be very much aligned with being sexually liberated. It is an active decision that you can make over and over again into adulthood. And so we don't believe that being a sexually empowered person and a person of faith is mutually exclusive. And oftentimes when we're in these spaces, like in Western sex positive spaces, we're expected to choose. And then in Muslim communities and Muslim spaces, I feel like we're also sort of expected to choose. And, we're an org that's saying, no, we can do both and.
Interesting. So it seems like you're challenging a number of forms of dominance, sort of dominant interpretations of Islam, colonial dominance, Christian frameworks. And you mentioned something at the end there that I know we wanted to get to, this sense in the larger anti-sexual violence, anti-domestic violence work. Religion is often seen as a problem, right? That if you just give up your religion, you might be freer, you might be less subject to violence or patriarchy, and there's also specific hostility toward Islam in the larger cultural and political climate. So how do these affect the work of the organizations you studied, Juliana, and then Nadiah Hart's work?
So I'm glad you asked, because I started out contacting people for the ethnographic portion of the research, fully expecting that no one would want to talk to me about this because it's the quintessential dirty laundry issue, right? So that advocates would be like, well, yeah, we're doing this, but we're not talking to you about it because God knows where that's going to go. And I was actually really surprised that that didn't happen so much, which I think I sort of want to connect back to this ethic of non-abuse and also the sort of commitment to reduce harm and to prevent harm, because those are overriding ethical commitments that even override sort of this issue of anti-Muslim hostility. At the same time, I have found in all of my work on Muslim communities in the US context, especially related to gender and sexuality, and that's not just sort of my sort of impression, that's a sort of reality. Muslims do not have internal conversations. We're always under, well, in the sort of least offensive way, under the gaze of people who have certain ideas about Islam and Muslims, and under on the worst end of the spectrum, under direct surveillance. And so, and Muslims are clearly very aware. In more recent work, I'm talking about a sort of porous Muslim American public square where these conversations take place. And of course, if you know that you're under surveillance, you're going to have that conversation differently. And so it's actually quite difficult to parse out what this awareness of these negative perceptions and stereotypes has on the work itself. Do you just sort of power through? Do you recognize it? Do you approach every non-Muslim advocate so that, like, with a sense of great caution? So it's definitely a barrier to the work, because it reframes the work in ways that make it more difficult to do it in the first place. So that seems like an important point, but it's also the continuous experience, and I want to name anti-Muslim hostility as a form of racism. So to not sort of skirt that and be like, yeah, and some people don't like Islam and some people don't like Muslims. It is a form of racism. It has many different ways in which it sort of expresses itself. One of the ones that's been around for quite some time, since like European colonialism, is the obsession, the literal obsession with Muslim women, and the supposedly totally special oppression of Muslim women, both by Islam and by Muslim men. Mm-hmm. And again, pushing back against those produces a particular type of discourse that is different from a discourse if that wasn't around. So that's always there. But it's also there in exceptionalist narratives where Muslims are represented as different. Pretty much every presentation to non-Muslim providers and sort of mainstream people starts with the level of DV is about the same in all communities as far as we know. Muslims are not especially domestically violent, but also not less. And so it's not a Muslim problem, but according to the advocates, it has a Muslim solution. And I want to point out that anti-Muslim hostility is not sort of a thing that individuals produce, it's a systemic problem. That is how it's part of racism. It's reproduced through media, it's produced and reproduced through the state. And one really important piece of that is that it relates to funding. That being a Muslim organization means that the barrier to convincing someone that you really are trying to liberate Muslim women, and you're doing it the right way, because clearly there's only one right way. I'm being snarky because it's the only way I can sort of address this as an issue, comes with, is there gonna be funding or is there not gonna be funding? So even in funding applications, adjusting to the fact that there is this gendered Islamophobia that runs wild in these circles, and there's a lot of racist issues more broadly in the anti-DV movement in particular. It's dominated by ideas from white feminists in the 70s, and it's been hard more broadly to sort of address how that's different in different communities and works out differently. So one of the real sort of challenges with it is that it comes with funding or no funding, whether you are able to at least rhetorically address that anti-Muslim hostility without in the process offending the people you want money from, right? So to put it in really stark terms. So it operates on many different levels and is kind of sort of, I now think of my work, I used to think I'm doing work on anti-Muslim hostility and I'm doing work on gender and sexuality in Muslim communities. I'm actually always doing both because they can't be disentangled from each other.
Right. Nadiah, how would you respond to that? Do you find the same in your own work?
Yeah, I was actually just kind of smiling as she was talking because my notes that I wrote for this were very much aligned with that. So I do want to speak on the surveillance piece, both how it impacts us externally, but also internally, right? So, you know, we're living in this world where there's increased surveillance and increased state violence towards our communities. As a result, there's a deep mistrust of state-funded programs. And, you know, majority of gender-based violence orgs, if you do an analysis, a lot of them have federal and state funding. And so, you know, this often creates a lot of tension in the communities that we're trying to serve. We do have one grant from the Office on Violence Against Women in the underserved program. And a lot of times that has been, you know, misunderstood to be, you know, working for the Trump administration or, you know, whatnot. And, you know, OVW is not Department of Homeland Security, right? Like they're two very different departments in the government, but because it's still the feds, a lot of times there's a lot of discomfort around that. But I also want to name that there's a reason that orgs have to be relying on this funding. And that's because the communities are not able to fund us, right? It's just that simple. There's not a priority giving to these issues. There's not there's a denial about how big the problem is. And so oftentimes it's really hard to not have to rely on those funding streams because the community is also not willing to fund us. And so, you know, the other thing that I want to name is like, oftentimes what results, because Muslim women are often not in positions of leadership either. I mean, that's changing now, as we can see in mainstream and Muslim communities, but, you know, they're often not at the table when funding decisions and policy decisions and all of that are made. And so what's resulting in that is that a lot of times our Muslim communities and Muslim survivors are invisibilized during an era where they're hyper visible. So it's really, it's just becomes really challenging. And the last thing that I want to say that Juliana, you kind of touched on, I kind of want to go a little bit deeper into that, is that language matters. So the ways in which Muslims are otherized is also really interesting to see in funding and policy decisions. So if I was to write a grant right now for, you know, money for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and then I replaced intimate partner violence with honor killings, the sexiness of that grant application is more likely to be funded than if I say intimate partner violence, because all of my other peer orgs are also saying intimate partner violence. And I think that that is really frustrating, that Muslims are exotified and otherized in that way. And it's also tempting for under-resourced orgs, because most of the time these orgs are very under-resourced, to actually take that money and do good, right? And so this is like the permanent cycle of that we're always in when we're thinking about funding and things like that.
I think that's really helpful. I mean, Juliana, do you want to respond? It looks like you're ready to respond to that. I mean, both of you have talked about this issue of silencing and invisibilizing, I think was your word that you just used. I mean, how does that work with you, Juliana?
So I want to sort of go back to something that I actually learned from the advocates in the process of sort of getting myself acquainted with how anti-domestic violence is framed and how it's done. And I have found that particular piece so useful that I use it all the time, and in other contexts, like in teaching, for example, as well, which is to think of various factors when it's like it comes out of domestic violence work that is helping victims. And it's this idea that as a provider, as someone who's helping a victim, you help them identify what is called resources and roadblocks, and different concepts or different pieces of someone's life, including their family, culture, religion, profession, various other kinds of things, can sort of be one or the other. And assessing where resources lie is a really important piece, because there are never enough resources, like from an anti-DV organization, from a service organization, right? And so like identifying what are my resources and what are the roadblocks to me getting to where I need to be is sort of a really basic approach that I've seen. And I find that that works really well to make an argument. It's a little binary for my sort of scholarly taste, but it can be helpful, for example, to say, rather than saying, as theoretical feminists very often do, that religion is always the problem or a problem because religion is inherently patriarchal. And then, you know, if you ask a little bit deeper, Islam is particularly patriarchal among the different religions. So the exceptionalism and the sort of hostility hold there as well. So rather than saying we can't do anything with religion because it's so patriarchal that it's not redeemable, it's actually possible to think of Islam as a resource, which is what the anti-DV advocates are doing. And they themselves will be the first to say, no, Islam is also used as a roadblock. When your husband says, the Quran says that you are supposed to be obedient to me, otherwise I can hit you, the particular Islam of that is a roadblock. And so ultimately what ends up happening is a much more nuanced sort of way to think about religion, not as an abstract thing, but as something, and we keep touching on that sort of can be utilized in different ways. Mm-hmm. And there is, I think, a general reluctance in the anti-DV movement to think about religion. I found that when I was looking at sort of interreligious projects against DV in particular contexts, that it's just not the main way to go about it. That has to do with the feminist history of the way the DV movement is framed in the US context in particular. And that's a conversation that's to be had on the level of advocates, but also on the level of scholars. And so one of the conversations that I see myself having is with other feminist scholars. Some religious, the vast majority of feminist theorists are secular and don't really want anything to do with religion, but to intervene in that conversation and to do it from a particular position as a Muslim feminist, to sort of to demand that at the very least this roadblock resource sort of idea is considered before we throw all of it out. And in the process, I mean, one of the really big disconnects is that also disconnects the movement then from Muslim victims, right? People for whom, as Nadiah said, religion is in fact important and could be a resource.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I want to remind the audience that we're about ready to take audience questions, so please post them in the chat. I hope you've heard some things that have provoked questions or things that you want to hear about in more depth. So I think, Juliana, you're talking about engaging feminists in a conversation about religion as resource as well as roadblock. And Nadiah, in terms of whom you want to engage in conversation, do you, I mean, who are your conversation partners, people whose minds you would like to change about working with Muslim communities?
That's such a great question. There's so many. So I live between like the movement world and like the Muslim communities world. And so I really, my vision and what I really want to work towards in the next couple of years is a very intentional and strategic partnership between Muslim advocates like myself that are doing the work on the ground and feminist scholars, Muslim feminist scholars like Juliana and Keisha, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, all of them, to like sort of bridge that gap and really bring what's good about activism to scholarship and what's good about scholarship to act and have that scholarship kind of inform the activism. So that's one of the groups of people that I really want to be in partnership with. In terms of other people, I think, you know, it's very necessary for us as one of the few Muslim-led organizations that's working at a national level to also be at at all the coalitions and the movement spaces that are happening that are right now still, like a lot of them are led by white women, and just really thinking about how can we ensure that our voices are also represented at those tables, and sort of be, you know, add that nuance. I think that's really important. Like a couple years ago, I was at a convening that was featuring, it was on reproductive rights, and it was featuring some of the leading reproductive rights and justice practitioners in the movement, and they were talking about faith in particular, and how oftentimes how faith shows up in this movement. And so one of the questions that I asked was, you know, so we are talking about how we can make faith frameworks fit into the reproductive rights framework, but have we thought about how we can do the opposite, where we fit the faith framework into a reproductive rights conversation? And there was kind of silence there. It was kind of like, wait, no one's asked us this question before. And I think it needs to be asked, because I think we have to be able to, you know, do that back and forth and sort of pull from what we are inspired by from the faith and find empowering, and also what we can learn from the reproductive rights and reproductive justice frameworks and introduce to faith communities. And I think both conversations need to happen.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that both of you have talked about compassion and justice, and I think, Nadiah, you added equality as sort of basic principles that you draw from the Islamic tradition. And I think each of those terms means different things. You know, when you're talking about engaging with feminists or engaging with DV advocates in the anti-DV movement, how do you explain the sort of the Islamic perspective on compassion, justice, and equality when you're engaging with, say, secular activists or other feminist scholars?
So the way that I talk about it generally, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to repeat, I really believe that every human being is God's creation and has integrity with God. And so, you know, we believe that God is Ar-Rahman, the most compassionate, and Muslims are invited time and time again in the Quran, in the Sunnah, to practice this kind of compassion with each other. And so just really, you know, inviting people to think about how gender-based violence is an extremely lonely and scary and traumatic time for a person. And it doesn't have to be, if, you know, we can center compassion. And because that's often a way that we show them that we hear them, that we believe them, that they're not alone. And that can be so transformative to one's ability to heal from a situation. And I want to also clarify, Lance, that like, that's not a conversation I only have to have with secular folks. That's often, more often than not, that's a conversation I have to have in Muslim communities, because I want to sort of name something that happens in Muslim communities, and that is this identity politics that happens around who is the perfect victim and whose victimhood is believed and whose is not. And oftentimes, you know, gender-based violence situations can get messy. They can often involve other sort of topics and situations that we're uncomfortable with. So, you know, whether it's dating or whether it's same-sex intimacy or, you know, drug abuse or alcohol abuse, right? Like it can often involve other situations that we're also uncomfortable with as Muslims. And I think that oftentimes that's what happens in Muslim communities is we end up focusing on the victim's behavior and analyzing that, intellectualizing that, and saying, well, what could they have done to prevent that? And therefore it's their fault. And that's when we lose the compassion and our ability to actually just hold space and provide you know, just be there for them in their moment of crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Juliana, would you want to talk about that as well? And what these Islamic principles mean?
Yeah, so of course, for me, that's a trick question. Because as a scholar, I will I'll tell you that those are constructed and mean different things to different people, as you said, which doesn't necessarily take away from how powerful they are. Many of the things, I mean, gender is a social construct, but look what it's doing to our societies, right? Like that it's a social construct doesn't mean it's not powerful. And I really like the point that Nadiah just made, that is not so much about having to convince Muslims that compassion and justice are somehow important for Muslims, but that they are more important than other things, right? So the conversation is most of the time, I think, not whether we all agree what we mean by justice. And no, I don't talk about equality because too much of a feminist, too much deconstruction. But what do we mean by justice? What do we mean by compassion? Who measures what is harmful? If you want to prevent harm, you have to have some kind of notion of what's harmful. And so how does that get measured? And I think there is also a sort of, it's not only about like the right kinds of victims, but it's also about measuring how bad harm is, how like what constitutes something that we should actively work to stop. Is it only the physical injuries? Is it something that the US criminal justice system doesn't really have, which is capturing the harm that psychological abuse does, right? So, and Nadiah was earlier talking about sort of the spectrum of what constitutes sexual violence and how difficult it is to prove any of those, but also what does it mean that we rely on the legal system, the criminal justice system, to address forms of gender-based violence in a deeply patriarchal state that clearly has really patriarchal laws. So, and Muslims sort of run into it. I often think of it as sort of like not even getting it from two sides or from both sides, so like a rock and a hard place, but really from all sides, and sort of persevering through that and saying, no, I'm going to have this conversation. I'm going to bring it up again. We're going to talk about sexual violence. No, we're not only going to talk about how really awesome Islamic marriage is in theory and what you should do to make yours better. And I'm not being snarky here. It's an approach, but it can't stop there, right? Like it can't stop right before this is what the injuries look like. I really struggled, for example, with one advocate who in a particular context insisted that at every DV awareness event, there would be posters with pictures of physical injuries. And I couldn't stomach it. I had real problems with it, but I could also see why she was doing it, what it was supposed to sort of jolt into awareness that somehow doesn't arrive any other way. So I think one of the things that I want to add to what Nadiah said earlier is that for me, the relationship between scholars and advocates is is hopefully one of the things I was hoping to do with the book was, one, to show that advocates actually do produce knowledge actively all the time, and that scholars are sort of, for various reasons, somewhat secondary to that as a project. And it sounds a little corny, but one purpose of the book was really just to highlight that this work exists and that these people exist and that this is what they do all day long and on call all night long, right? Like really just to say, here are some of the, well, not faces literally, but like here is some of the sort of human aspect of, did you even know that this is happening? That's true in Muslim communities, and it's true in the wider society. And to also show, and that's sort of that's what I'm taking into my next project, that advocacy work is knowledge production. That it's not that some scholars know some stuff and then, you know, like are nice enough to impart it. And at the very least, I think the book does. That's what I've heard from people who've read it, including Nadiah, who is very kind to me when she talks to me about the book. But has to do with reading the book being a moment of reflection on things that advocates and service providers in particular often don't have time to reflect on, right? Like to sort of think, okay, she says we're producing knowledge. How are we doing that? How do we actually take control of that process? And what are some of the repercussions that we're not able to see, but a scholar can see? So part of it is sort of a mirroring of these efforts and pointing out thoughtfully that some of these might not land the way they were intended. That's not sort of primary knowledge production. It's a much more sort of symbiotic process, which is actually where I would like to be.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's the conversation I think
Right.
that the two of you would really welcome. We have a couple of questions from the audience. One was, would you like to see, I mean, you were talking about the patriarchal laws, right? Would you like to see changes to VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, to benefit Muslim communities? Can you more concretely delineate some of the ways in which 1970s white feminist DV ideas caused problems for Muslim anti-DV activism? And does the anti-racist work and increasing activism of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and anti-DV and anti-sexual violence individuals and groups help your work? If so, how? Those are like, that's packing a lot.
I can speak to some of that. So, you know, it is true that the DV and, you know, anti-violence like sort of movements have historically been white-led. And what I'm finding to be heartwarming and giving me a lot of hope is that a lot of that is changing, where a lot of these you know, really big national organizations are recognizing their failings of giving people of color and women of color in particular authentic leadership roles and really putting them in leadership roles. And so there are actually funders that are pivoting now and that are focusing primarily on giving money to BIPOC-led orgs and things like that, because they recognize the power of people of color-led movements, of, you know, people who are directly impacted, leading the work, survivor-led work. And oftentimes, you know, we as women of color, you know, embody a lot of those identities at once. And so I don't even remember the question anymore, but I do want to acknowledge that, like, that is giving me hope. And, you know, that's one of our visions at Heart. You know, I didn't even share this in the introduction, but one of the subconscious like things that were happening was actually a personal journey for me, you know, back in the day when I was a young mom, trying to, you know, make an authentic contribution to the spaces that I was working in, and was finding it frustrating that my decision to be lead parent was not being honored or upheld or accommodated in the ways that I needed it to. And so a lot of the vision that we have at heart is to also, you know, as we think about building our internal culture, thinking about what is it, is our organization different, and what are the needs of our people? How are they different than a white-led organization and their needs and the things that come up? And I probably did not answer the question because, like I said, I don't remember them anymore, but that's what I wanted to share.
Juliana, do you want to take part of that?
Sure. Thank you. It's a big question, and I want to one sort of on a really sort of meta level talk a little bit more about the systemic issues that we've sort of been touching on, because one of the things that I see happening both in scholarly circles and also in activist circles is that we're often as well, I am maybe as a scholar activist, but we're often told that we have to pick whether we want to work on racism or on sexism, right? So like you can do race stuff or you can do gender stuff, but God forbid you want to do both, because what that does is help you realize that these are interconnected systems of oppression, right? Like the sort of like the 101 of intersectional Black feminist analysis, that race and gender, and then to some degree also class, are overlapping forms of oppression, not overlapping forms of identity, but in fact overlapping systems of oppression. And so this being forced to pick, because doing both is dangerous to the system in a way that each separately isn't quite in the same way on this meta level, is a real challenge. I experience this all the time, this sort of like, so what are you doing? Which one is it? And when I say I'm doing both, they're like, no, you can't. Like, that's not how it works. You just don't get to do that. Mm-hmm. And then on a very practical level, in looking at the question that is thankfully in a Google Doc that I can look at, because otherwise I'd be like, this was a very big question. I want to point to things like the way we figured out in the DV movement that white middle-class feminist concerns about domestic violence weren't addressing everyone equally. So to give you a specific example, that is a common discussion in communities of color, especially in Black communities, is whether to call the police. So to come back to the criminal justice framework, whether to call the police on a male abuser, because those are communities that have completely different experiences with the police, with police violence. Mm-hmm. And as a victim, you are also part of networks and communities that are not only about your individual's safety, but that invite the police to that community in ways that endanger more than that one person, the abuser. And that's aside from lots of research that shows that women of color especially can often not afford for their abuser to be arrested because he is also the economic provider. And so it's just a different type of victimization. These are all systemic problems that the legal stuff around domestic violence doesn't really address. Mm-hmm. And then this question about Wawa and Muslim communities is really tricky, because the US, as a supposedly secular country, can actually not really operate with religious identity categories. And Muslims should, in an ideal scenario, not want them to either, right? So like you wouldn't want the introduction of a Muslim legal category that there is no Jewish or Christian equivalent to, and then ask that certain types of things are addressed on the basis of that identity category. Where that happens is in negative ways after 9/11, where it becomes a pseudo-legal category, mostly through immigration law. And then it shows up again in the Muslim ban and in the debate before the 2016 election about a Muslim registry. Those are all not good things to connect to Muslim efforts against domestic and sexual violence. And so I think it's actually a really difficult question strategically to figure out how to work with religious identity categories and the communities attached to them, and recognize that that's another rock in a hard place. It's not, it doesn't solve certain issues. One of the things that I found sort of on an anecdotal level is that on the state level, sometimes Muslim organizations who identify as Muslim organizations do get funding. And in other states, the pot of money that's there for violence prevention, domestic violence prevention in particular, is held tight by people who are very uncomfortable with religion and would never consider a Muslim identified organization as a grant recipient. And so then there again, there's sort of this question of what makes an organization a Muslim organization. Mm-hmm. Is it sort of ethnically defined? There is lots of stuff that one can do with the racialization of Muslims. So this idea that it is a pseudo-racial category rather than a religious one, but that too is mostly applied in negative terms. Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, WAVA has been sort of dissolved at the edges and is always in danger of not being reapproved. And there, every time it needs to be reapproved, there is stuff that's taken away as a precondition for continued funding. And so I think Muslims are really tiny pawns in those debates. What I think the debate about WAVA, whatever the legal term is, the sort of refunding decision is really indicative of where the US as a whole is in terms of work against violence against women. And I will say it now, someone asked me privately in the chat, and I want to just say like one little thing about it, but even the violence against women language, rather than gender-based violence, is constantly under scrutiny, right? So is sort of a remnant of feminists insisting to focus on women. There are various directions in which that is a more complicated thing, but I also talk in the book in some places about the backlash, the patriarchal backlash against feminist framing around women, mm-hmm. that results in perpetual, but what about the men that are being abused? Isn't that equally bad? And what happens to your feminist critique when the woman is the abuser? And most of the time it's a really unfortunate sort of turn of events when Muslim men then start joking about that. Which is a sign of discomfort, but this discussion about how do you talk about domestic violence when the CDC now has statistics that show that 35% of men in the United States who are being surveyed indicate that they're psychologically abused, right? And then how do you provide services when they're not for women as victims only anymore? And so like there's a lot of stuff that's just moving pieces. Yeah. That I think make the grassroots work incredibly complicated, because really just knowing about it, let alone participating in these conversations, also takes away from the very practical sort of hands-on work.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very thorough answer to that particular question. I think you framed some of the challenges very well. I've noted that we have about 4 minutes left. I wanted to give you both a chance to sort of talk, to answer one last question, you see, from Dr. Ali. Both of you have really talked about working on the basis of women's experiences and perspectives. So beginning with women's experiences and then going out from there to interpret the legal, the religious, the psychological. So what are the benefits and the challenges of working from the basis of women's experience in your experience? So let's start with Nadiah.
How to answer this in like 1 minute. I would say that, so first of all, I want to clarify that, you know, we were originally founded to be Heart Women and Girls. And since then, over the years, we've evolved, and our legal name is still Heart Women and Girls, but we like to refer to ourselves as Heart. And that's just to recognize that more than just women are marginalized in the communities that we work in, and we want to be inclusive of gender nonconforming folks, male survivors, trans people, etc. And so that is one of the things that I wanted to share in terms of benefits of starting from women's experiences. I think I'll keep it really short. I think one of the things that I think about a lot is, there is, Islamic law and Islamic tradition that is a lot of times informed and interpreted and taught by males. And it does not take into account lived experience and how lived experience can interact with Islamic law and tradition. And so for us, it's always, we find it both challenging and beneficial to sort of center lived experience as the expertise that we are trying to uplift.
Thank you. Juliana.
I don't know that I can top that 1 minute answer that said all of it.
Yeah.
So I'll put it in a slightly different way. I will say from a methodological perspective, working with and relying on people's experience is very complicated. Feminists have spent 4 decades debating what that would look like and how you do that. And so I want to get at it maybe from a completely different perspective, because there's often this, especially in October during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, someone will say 1 in 4 women is abused in her lifetime by an intimate partner, or something along those lines. And those numbers exist, and they get sort of peddled and distributed and mentioned in order to jolt people into doing something about it. I talk in the book a little bit about what I think about statistics and surveys and what that helps us do. And my question is always, what if it was 1 in 10? What if it was 1 in 50? What if the numbers were much smaller? At what point is it not a big enough issue? And that's, I think, in a different way where experience comes in. Because if one woman or one gender nonconforming person experiences abuse that traumatizes them, that's 1 too many, and we need to do something about it. And so in that particular instance, the experience of that one person is a reason to do something about it. So that's not sort of skirting the methodological issue, but for me, that's sort of turning this ethical commitment back towards myself to say, and unless we have a situation where no one is being harmed and traumatized, we need to do something about it. And it doesn't matter if it's 1/4 or 1%.
Well, thank you all very much. And I think, Keisha, you're gonna close us out. And we have a final slide with contact information for our speakers. I want to thank everyone.
Right. So please, I want to call your attention to 2 things. One, there is a link in the chat with a link direct to Professor Hammer's book and a discount code that you can use until March 31st. There also is a survey that Hart is asking folks to take, and you see also a link to that on the slide. Please join me in thanking our conversation partners and our moderator. This has been really wonderful. Thank you to Zach behind the scenes and Sophie, who organized everything, and my colleague Anthony Petro, whose distinguished teaching professorship provided the funds for this event, as well as all of our partners across BU's College of Arts and Sciences, School of Public Health, and the medical school. We're very, very grateful. And the video for this event will eventually be posted along with the transcript or the finished captions, which means that when you get a link, as you will because you registered, you can share it with those who weren't able to be here today. You can also visit the Health Humanities site at BU and check out the video from our previous panel on Islam, race, and COVID-19. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.